Well, good morning, everyone. I'm extremely pleased to see so many people here, and I also know that there are a lot more people online globally, so welcome to you all. My name's Professor Deborah Healey from UNSW Law and Justice. I'm a director of the China International Business and Economic Law Centre, and I'll be your moderator today. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people that are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present today. The conference is supported by a grant from the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the grant shortly. But at the moment, I have the honour of introducing the Deputy CEO of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, Helen Horsington, to provide the opening remarks. Her CV is in the program, and we're delighted that Helen could take the time to do this for us today. So welcome, Helen, and I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Healey, and welcome to everybody here this morning and to those of you who are joining us online. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their leaders, past and present. As Professor Healey has just kindly noted, I'm Helen Horsington. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, an Australian government initiative. Australia and China have complementary economies that benefit from strong trade and investment ties. A stable and constructive relationship between Australia and China is in the interests of both our countries. Both Australia and China's economies flourish when we work together to advance our mutual economic interests. China is, of course, Australia's largest trading partner, and it will remain so for the foreseeable future. Economic ties are a keystone of that relationship. Total two-way trade in goods and services between our countries reached a record $317 billion annually last June. And this relationship between both our countries is further enriched by long-standing cultural and community ties that date back through the generations. You will all be aware that over recent months, Australia and China have increased our dialogue and exchange, and we have both made positive steps to stabilise the relationship. This has been seen, for example, through the Prime Minister's visit to China last November, where he visited Beijing and Shanghai, as well as more recently, the visit just a few weeks ago to Australia by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Progress on our bilateral trade relations is, of course, in keeping with increasing engagement across the full breadth and depth of our relationship. This sustained engagement has helped stabilise the bilateral and trade relationship and has led to many previously impeded Australian exports re-entering the Chinese market, and we look forward to that continuing. On the Foundation's part, we were established in 2020 to be a national platform here in Australia to support enhanced engagement between Australia and China in Australia's national interests. We help play a role to support this bilateral dialogue and exchange, including through our annual grants program, which today's event is one. We have a grants program of up to $6.5 million a year, and this supports projects to promote cooperation between Australia and China in a range of issues that go to trade and investment and economic engagement. This includes on health and ageing, climate change and sustainability, and sustainable agribusiness, just by way of example. We fund a range of projects to also build capability and literacy here in Australia, including among Australian industry and businesses, to support informed, practical engagement with China. As an example, the Foundation has also supported AsiaLink Business to establish a China Digital Economy Academy. And through this academy, AsiaLink has helped Australian businesses build knowledge and confidence navigating Australia's digital commerce and trade landscape. But today, we're very pleased to be here to support UNSW's China International Business and Economic Law Centre to deliver today's conference. I should say, 20 years ago, before becoming a diplomat and joining the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I worked as a corporate lawyer in mergers and acquisitions for what is now Allens Linklaters, just up the road here. For many years working in this field, helping clients navigate complex deals and pretty tricky, evolving legal and policy landscapes, I do know and understand the importance of events like today's in promoting a platform for information exchange on issues such as trade law and digital finance. And I know that these frameworks are the enablers of trade and investment between our two countries, Australia and China, and the underpinnings of that economic relationship that is so important to Australia's interests. So it's really fantastic to be here today, to have met some of the panellists who will be speaking to you this morning, and some of the business representatives who are here today as well. Welcome. So I'm very confident that this conference will absolutely help Australia-China business in the digital age, as the conference theme is, and I very much look forward to hearing insights from all of the panellists this morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for your useful comments and also for making the time to be with us here today. It shows the relevance of this conference to the business community and to their advisors. I'd just like to make a few comments around the idea of why this conference is important and the background to the grant. As Helen says, and you will all know, there's no doubt about the importance of the China-Australia trade relationship viewed from both sides. It's also crucial that businesses in both countries understand the commercial environments in which they will operate as sellers and purchasers of goods and services. And that should give them the confidence to deal in different economic environments and different legal systems, which they'll have to do. At the outset, I'd also like to give you some brief information about CIBEL itself, which is the centre which has organised this today, and about the nature of the grant. CIBEL was established in 2015 at the University of New South Wales following years of research work on China by various UNSW academic staff representatives, but in a more ad hoc manner. In 2015, we were funded by the university to start the centre, and in the following years, we brought 5 mainland Chinese researchers and scholars to UNSW to work in the centre in a variety of international business and economic law areas. They also form part of the academic staff of UNSW Law and Justice, and they teach intergeneral courses as well as in their specialty areas. So it's been a very successful transition for us at UNSW to have these Chinese scholars who are now part of the furniture at UNSW. Now, CIBEL researches in a wide range of international business and economic law areas, some of which are represented in this conference. But I just thought I'd raise with you other areas of law and policy in which CIBEL works, which are just as important. Other CIBEL colleagues not here today, research in areas such as sovereign investment and foreign investment, corporate law, the role of government in the market and state-owned enterprises, competition law and policy more generally, sustainability issues and their impact on commerce, intellectual property, consumer protection, banking and finance more generally than just digital banking and finance, data governance, and overall international economic governance. So, and it's important to note that in all of this, CIBEL focuses on the impact of China in the APEC region, not just on Chinese law itself. So as part of this, we provide information for lawyers, businesses and business groups, but also work with government, regulators and academics globally to undertake research and provide knowledge and practical recommendations in relevant areas. Now, the grant from the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations was awarded to CIBEL last year, and I'm the chief investigator. My CIBEL co-director, Weiwan Zhu, who will be on the second panel, and researcher Xu Bai, along with our centre manager, Fion Chua, and administrative and marketing staff are also involved. The grant funded us to hold this conference and a high-level conference at the end of this year, and to bring to Australia 4 of our speakers today, so we're very grateful for that. In formulating the content for this conference, we consulted very widely in Australia and China, speaking to businesses, diplomats, business groups and other academics during work in Australia and visits to China. So we trust we'll find the conference informative, thought-provoking and useful. So, as I noted above, conference in business is very important, and the grant is all about assisting Chinese and Australian businesses to have confidence when dealing with one another. So we thank the National Foundation for assisting us in our work. We thank Kingwood Mallisons for allowing us to hold the conference in the city today, and we are extremely grateful to all the eminent speakers who've agreed to join us. We've structured the conference to leave plenty of time in each session for questions, so we hope you will avail yourselves of the opportunities to ask plenty of questions. Now, I've also been asked to speak at this point about general housekeeping matters, so I will do that. The closest bathrooms are on the left-hand side of the room. In the event of an emergency, the floor warden will guide you to the closest emergency exit located at the back of the room. For Q&A, online attendees will be muted and your camera disabled for the duration of the conference, but during Q&A, please use the Q&A function for your questions. For in-person attendees, speakers have been placed on tables. Please click on the button and wait for the green light to turn on before asking your questions so our online attendees can hear you. One of our team members will also have a microphone available. So those are the housekeeping issues I've been asked to relay to you. And without more, I will call on the members of the first panel to please come up to the podium and we can start the conference proper. But once again, you might like to show thanks to Helen for coming along and opening the conference for us. Okay, so Liyang and Kate, and we have one speaker online who is, this is a competition law conference, and our third speaker, Yan Yu, is at the American Bar Association's annual spring conference in New York, and will be speaking from there. Panel number 1 is focused on the environments in China and Australia for regulating digital competition. And this is clearly of importance to businesses who want to trade in both countries. The development and growth of digital markets have been major topics in competition law for around 10 years or more, because digital markets operate differently to other markets and turn many competition law assumptions on their head. Tests for market definition, for example, based on price, are not helpful when platforms don't charge customers. Concepts such as competition for the market rather than in the market have become really more important in relation to digital. There is a lot of discussion of ecosystems and also of killer acquisitions of small innovative companies by establishing digital platforms and big digital companies. Of course, the smaller companies are often developed for such a takeover by a large platform or a larger company. And it's really hard for the regulators to know what would have happened without the acquisition. Has there been a lessening of competition by the acquisition? Well, were they really a potential competition absent the acquisition? Or were they just ripe for development by the better resourced company? Would they have gone anywhere without the acquisition? There are many other examples that could be raised, but these are some of the things which keep competition lawyers like me awake at night. And of course, you have to put against that the fact that competition laws try to avoid chilling innovation. And innovation's a hallmark of digital commerce and provides the counterpoint to overreaching competition laws which might be implemented. I've often said that if I spent 24 hours a day every day reading articles, I couldn't possibly read everything that comes out on digital competition at the moment. So this is a very rich environment for competition lawyers. Important issues continue to emerge and we need to get it right. And if you're operating in the market, this is a bit of a maze for you all. So against the background of issues like this in digital trade, the format of the panel will be that each of the panellists will speak for about 15 minutes on the issue of regulation of digital competition in their jurisdiction from an academic, regulatory or economic and business point of view based on the speaker. I will then ask the panel some questions for about 20 minutes and then the rest of the time will be available for questions from the floor. So panel 1 is composed of, to my far left, Professor Liyang Hou from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Kate Reeder, Head of Digital at the ACCC, and Yan Yu, an economist from RBB Economics, who is online and is well placed to present a legal, economic and business point of view from the perspective of both Australia and China due to the nature of her work here in China and in the APAC region. Their CVs are in the program, but I can say that they all are important contributors to the debate around digital competition law issues, which is why they were invited to participate. So let's start with Professor Hou. Thank you.
Okay, so many thanks for Professor Healey to invite me here today. I'm so glad to meet here. Is okay? Can you hear me? Okay, good. So my presentation is about competition and regulation in the digital sector in China. So Professor Healey just mentioned a couple of anti-competitive conduct in the digital sector today. I'm not going to touch upon any kind of conduct specifically because my presentation will focus on the landscape or give an overview to competition regulation in the digital sector in China. So my presentation will be brief. If you have any question, we can have a discussion afterwards. Next slide, please. So if you look at, well, Chinese digital sector has been very good in the last years. As everybody know, we are only second to the United States and has surpassed Europe and Eastern Asian countries, Australia, for example. A lot we have presented to the world a number of big internet giants like Tencent, Alibaba, etc., etc. In the last 10 years, the Chinese government have paid a lot of attention to digital economy and imposed a number of regulations. So from my personal perspective, we can divide those regulations into 3 stages. So as you can see from here, before 2018, there were basically no regulation at all. Then between 2018 and 2021, that's a stage of minimum regulation. Then after 2021, we entered a new stage, so-called strengthened regulation. I will touch upon every phase one by one. Next slide, please. Okay. So as everybody probably know, the founder of Facebook, Zuckerberg, ever said that well, what Facebook needs to do is to move fast and break things. And the things he mentioned here, well, include a lot, but one of them definitely law. So what Facebook or all the other internet giants have done was to break laws. As you can see, there being a lot of conflict between internet economy or digital economy with the traditional economy. For example, like the conflict between Uber and the traditional taxi drivers, etc., etc. So, although digital economy represents innovation to the society, they do impose they do inflict challenges to the traditional regulatory regime. At the initial stage, the Chinese government applied the so-called tolerant, prudent regulation, which was promoted by the ex-prime minister Li Keqiang. Tolerance means that we should tolerate the break-thin perspective of the digital economy. We should allow them to grow. And prudent means that we should not impose heavy regulation to suppress the development of a digital economy. So at the very beginning, basically, if you check the documents adopted by State Council of China, you can find that keywords something like stimulating, improving, promoting the digital economy, etc., etc. I just listed here like two most important documents adopted by the State Council, which was first the guidance on actively promoting Internet plus economy. Internet plus means that Internet plus anything like offline economy. So basically, it's kind of transformation from offline economy to digital economy. That's Internet plus, and something also like promoting sharing economy. The key point is exactly suggested by the tolerant and prudent regulation. We should do everything to accommodate, to promote the development of digital economy. So what they ever do, we should make a law adaptive to their development. So next slide, please. But starting from the year of 2018, the attitude of the government, of Chinese government, changed a little bit. So around that year, we basically gradually realized that digital platforms or digital operators bears two types of roles. One, in neutral sense, they're business operators. In a negative sense, they're kind of profit maximizer. On the other hand, they also play the role of market organizers. So we just look at the e-marketplace as an example. So on the one hand, they provide the intermediary services to business users and end users. So they successfully put those two types of users together to finalize their transactions. On the other hand, they also pursue their own profit. So starting this year, the government realized that sometimes digital operators might abuse their role as a market organizer to pursue their own profit. Then we just move attention to the second type of the role of the digital operators. So as a market organizer. So at this stage, China adopted two important laws. One is the e-commerce law, e-commerce regulation. Another one is the data privacy regulation. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's just first look at the e-commerce law. Basically, this law only regulates the e-market places, and basically the e-marketplaces were regulated by themselves by the so-called intra-platform rules adopted by digital platforms like Alibaba. In China, we also have Pinduoduo and JD.com. Those are three most important e-commerce platform in China. So the law is basically divided into two parts. The first part emphasizes the similarity between e-platforms and the traditional sellers. the obligations that should be respected by offline sellers should also be respected by the e-commerce platforms. Most importantly, the law also imposed some new obligations on e-commerce platforms. I just list three new obligations here. So first one is that the e-commerce platform should adopt online resolution mechanism, because it's not like all types of online disputes can be solved by the traditional justice. They first go to the e-commerce online dispute resolution first, then go to the justice. And secondly, it's also a legal obligation for the e-commerce platforms to adopt their online trust mechanism, like based on reviews, etc. And last one, the most important one, is also this partial exemption of the joint liability of the e-commerce platform. The traditional marketplace bear joint liability with the seller they host, but it's not really possible for e-commerce platforms if we allow the e-commerce platform to bear joint liability as the traditional ones. There could be no e-commerce business. So we give the so-called notice delete obligation to e-commerce platform operators. We can discuss this obligation later on, but here I just want to everybody knows that the joint liability is different in the online settings. Next slide, please. And the next most important law is Personal Information Protection Law. So this law is to prohibit the online operators from exploiting users' information. So basically, online operators got two things from end users. One, we have been already very familiar with, is the attention. They get our eyeballs on their things, called attention. Another one, they also get our data. Those things was not regulated. So in my online operators might excessively collect our information. So this is the purpose of this law. This law differentiates two types of personal data. One is so-called normal personal data. Another one is sensitive personal data, including something like biometric information, religion, belief, health, etc. Those things, when we lost, we also lost our human dignity. So the protection for the two types of personal information is different. For normal personal information, the online operators might get, both the collection of both type of information based on consent. However, for the first type of information, the online operator might get it based on the so-called general consent, based on, for example, like user agreement. When we click the user agreement, it means that we have to give a consent to the online operators. Then they can collect our normal personal information. But we can also withdraw our consent anytime afterwards. The protection for sensitive information is something like we can see that the collector can only collect those information based on a clear and individual consent. And secondly, the use of information must be based on specific and necessary purposes. Next slide, please. The regulation at the second phase still comply with the tolerant and prudent regulatory attitude, and the regulatory focus was on the relationship between the platform operators and users. There is another dimension in the digital economy, which is a competition relation between different platform operators. So at this is the focus of the regulation at the third stage. So the third stage started at the end of 2020. Basically, the central government in China made an announcement that we should strengthen anti-monopoly and prohibit disordered capital expansion. Then starting from 2021, we have intensively enforced the anti-monopoly law, and also we proposed a regulation which is very similar to the Digital Markets Act in the European Union. Next slide, please. So first, starting from 21, we enforced the law in a very aggressive way. As you can see from these slides, well, in the last, basically it's the period starts from 21 to 22. We haven't seen much in 2023. Basically, there are no enforcement. So in such a very short period, 2 years something, we have observed 107 antitrust decisions. So 4 cases fall into the zone of abusing dominance, and the other case related to merge control. By the way, we have a different mechanism, merge control. In China, merge control is based on compulsory pre-notification thing, and in Australia, I suppose it's kind of voluntary or more or less voluntary thing. Professor Healey can correct me afterwards. I just want to point out some cases, some important cases. 4 cases of abusing dominance and one merge case. I just first touch upon the merge case. You can see that it's related to Tencent. It's one of the blocked merge cases in China. One of the four blocked merge cases. And this is the one take place in the digital sector. Another case is the Alibaba case. In this case, the authority imposed an antitrust fine with a historical record. So it's 18 billion yuan. Alibaba was fined because it requires its business operator to operate only on its own platform rather than competitors' platform. All the other cases are also more or less similar, but with a lesser fine. Okay, so my presentation just ends here. And if you have any question, I'm happy to discuss with you afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Liyang. I would actually add one thing. Up until yesterday, Australia didn't have a compulsory notification system, but laws, the minister announced yesterday that Australia's merger laws would be changing, and that as from January 2026, we would have a compulsory notification system like China's, because there are only 3 countries in the world that really don't have them at the moment. And there's been a bit of gaming of the system in Australia, particularly by digital corporations. So that's just a postscript to your comments. But thank you very much for your insightful comments. At this point, I would like to call on Kate Reeder from the ACCC, who is the head of the digital branch, and she will be talking on what Australia's been doing. And would you like to speak at the podium, or you want to speak here? Okay, good. Look, I just want to say before Kate starts that Australia has been quite influential internationally at the approaches it's taken to dealing with digital competition issues and its approach to digital platforms. And it's in the middle of a 5-year funded research project which is highly consultative on various issues relating to competition in the digital space. So, we're really doing something in that space, and Kate will be able to tell us what's happening at the moment. So thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a privilege to be here and to hear Professor as well on these topics. So if I could go to the first slide, please. So I'd just like to cover a bit of history in terms of the ACCC's work in digital platform space. So the ACCC was first directed to look at digital platforms as part of our original digital platforms inquiry, which went from 2017 to 2019. So that inquiry primarily looked at issues surrounding digital platforms and media companies, as well as advertising and the impact on consumers. That inquiry produced 23 recommendations, a number of which the government chose to take up. One of those recommendations was to form a digital platforms branch within the ACCC, of which myself and Morag Bond jointly led together for a number of years. Morag has now gone on to lead the division that writes the codes at the eSafety Commission, also in the digital platform space. So we are very, very involved and have been involved for a number of years in digital platforms issues. That inquiry also suggested that the ACCC look into the ad tech issues, and we undertook an 18-month ad tech inquiry, which finished in 2021, specifically into those issues. The 5-year digital platform services inquiry has so far looked at a wide number of services. So if we just go to the next slide, got listed there, all of our reports. So every 6 months we produce a report on a different service or theme. So our first report in September 2020 was on online private messaging. So we looked specifically on over-the-top messaging type services, how they operate. We also updated some of our findings in relation to social media and search. Our second report looked at app marketplaces. So we were specifically looking at Google Play and the Apple Play Store as well. So the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. So, and we were looking there to understand the market dynamics about how those services operate, how developers who develop apps interact with those stores, and how consumers use those services. In September 2021, in our third report, we again revisited search. So we looked at search defaults and choice screens, and partly this was because in Europe they had introduced a choice screen, and so we were very interested to see how the choice screen had operated in Europe. We had recommended in our first original digital platforms inquiry that choice screens could be introduced in Australia. That was a recommendation that was not taken up by the government at the time. We have continued to revisit that issue, so we revisited in the third report, and we will be revisiting it in report 9, which is the issues paper we have just put out. Our fourth report was into online retail marketplaces, so which I tend to refer to in Australia as the cakes. So Catch, Amazon, Kogan and eBay. Those are the largest retail marketplaces in Australia. So we're a little bit different than other jurisdictions such as China, but also different than Europe and the US, who have Amazon's very dominant in those jurisdictions. So we're keen to revisit that finding, hopefully in our 10th report, just to see how the market has moved on. So in our 5th report, which is our halfway mark for the Digital Platform Services Inquiry, we decided that we would look, instead of looking at a specific service, we would look to see what had been happening overseas. We know a lot of jurisdictions, including China, had been moving in terms of their regulatory position. Europe had moved to introduce the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, so we were very keen to understand how the work that we had done to date, whether we felt there was a need for regulatory reform. So that report looked into those issues, and we did recommend to government that regulatory reform should be undertaken in Australia. So in some ways we are on a similar trajectory to China, as been pointed out by the professor. We originally were looking at sort of initial issues, and then we moved on to look into more detail, and then we've made recommendations for regulatory reform. Just to touch on briefly, our 6th report revisited social media services again. This was largely due to the emergence of TikTok. So Meta had made a number of public comments that TikTok was eating into its market share, so we were keen to look at that issue and see what the impact of the arrival of TikTok and the brief surgence of Be Real, which has subsequently disappeared, might have had on the services offered by Meta. Our 7th report, again, was a bit of a slight divergence from a service-based report. So we instead chose to look at product ecosystems. So what we were looking at here is the largest digital platforms operating in Australia and understanding how they were expanding their services into different markets. So we were particularly interested in the expansion of the large digital platforms into education, health, cloud storage, gaming, AI, and financial technology. As part of that report, we looked more specifically, we did a number of case studies. One of those was into personal cloud storage. We know a number of other jurisdictions overseas had looked into cloud, particularly commercial cloud, but we were looking at more personal cloud. So it's interesting to know, for example, if you have a phone, most of you would have a cloud service connected to that, which is for your backup or your photos, what the pricing was for that, how people interacted with that, whether they knew there was other options, and whether those options were used. So it was quite an interesting case study there. We also looked at smart home devices as another example of an expansion of digital platforms into these different types of services. So our eighth report was into data brokers. So here we were focusing on data products and services offered by data firms with no direct relationship with consumers. So in the report, we listed a number of example firms, but we weren't intending to sort of focus necessarily on those firms, but firms like Quantium, Experian, Ilion, who offer quite sophisticated data analysis and data enrichment services, but don't often have a direct relationship with consumers. As part of that project, we worked quite heavily with the Attorney General's Department and the Office of Information Commissioner. So our ninth report, which is was announced a couple of weeks ago, is revisiting general search. So that report will be due to the Treasurer on the 30th September 2024. We are in part revisiting search because there's been a number of changes, particularly as a result of the DMA being introduced, but also as a result of AI emerging on the landscape very recently. And so we're keen to revisit the dynamics in search and understand them better. And our final report, which feels slightly horrifying that we'll get to number 10 very shortly, early next year, is due to the Treasurer in March 2025. So the commissioners have not yet decided on the topics. It's probably worth pointing out that over the course of the inquiry, we had to do 10 reports. Commissioners chose topics as we went. We felt that was a clever thing to do, given how fast the market moves, that we not set out in advance what the topics would be, so that to allow maximum flexibility to change with the dynamics of the market. I suppose the only other thing that worth pointing out is just the importance of digital platforms to the Australian economy. In our report number 7, we set out some statistics, but it's probably worth just rattling a few off here. So 81% of Australians have a social media account. So $93 billion is the value of Australian mobile wallet transactions in 2023. So it's quite a lot of money being spent on your mobile phone. And almost 5 hours a day by smartphone users in Australia in January 2023, which is mildly horrifying. And according to the ACMA, almost 83% of people have a smart device. So it's quite a lot of time being spent on digital platform services. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'd just like to return to our report number 5, which set out the ACCC's views on regulatory reform. So we consider that regulatory reform is necessary. In the report, we set out why we think it's necessary. So we have identified a number of significant competition and consumer harms in our reports up until 5, but we continue to identify them in the reports we've put out since report number 5. We did discuss the limitations of using existing laws to try and tackle digital platforms issues, and my colleague has set out some of the problems there. Largely they're around things like the timing, the cost it takes, the difficulties in these changing dynamic markets of addressing the issues. If it takes 10 years for us to get a final judgment on a matter, obviously the markets have moved on quite significantly by then. The international momentum, so I think we were looking more about what was happening in various jurisdictions, particularly Europe, but also the UK. We know a number of our colleagues in Asia also, apart from China. Japan has been moving, and Korea has been undertaking sort of certain steps towards regulating digital platforms. And the scope and scale of the harms suggests that reform is needed now. And just from those statistics that I called out earlier, you'll see like how reliant we've become on digital platforms in such a short period of time. and how much time we spend on them. They are, to use the language of the Europeans, gatekeepers between a lot of businesses and consumers. So they have quite an important critical role in our economy now. So the report considered whether with some options, what form the regulatory reform should take. So next slide, please. So this slide just sets out the recommendations to government. There's both consumer measures and competition measures. So on the consumer side, we had suggested a prohibition on unfair trading practices. That's not a new thing. We actually suggested that back in 2019 in our original digital platforms inquiry report. We also reiterated the call for improved unfair contract term laws, which have subsequently been made by the government, which is we were very pleased to see. And on the consumer side, we also suggested, similar to China, mandatory dispute resolution processes for digital platforms to adopt those, and mandatory processes for scams, harmful apps, and fake reviews. And many of you will know the National Anti-Scam Centre has recently been introduced by the government, and they're currently working towards legislation and finalising how that process will work. So, in terms of the competition measures, we suggested codes of conduct for designated digital platforms, and that those codes of conduct should include targeted obligations to address anti-competitive conduct, barriers to entry, and unfair treatment of business users. So next slide, please. So just in terms of the international context, so these issues are the issues that have been identified by the ACCC are very consistent with those that have been identified overseas, including in China, the European Union's Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act, the United Kingdom's DMCC Bill, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Bill, which was introduced to Parliament last year, the 10th Amendment to the German Competition Act, which provides the Bundeskartellamt with the ability to designate platforms of paramount significance, and Japan's Act on improving transparency and fairness of digital platforms. We do think it's very important as a relatively smaller jurisdiction to work with these larger international jurisdictions and to try and achieve consistency. Most of these companies are large global companies, so we think there's benefit in developing new competition measures that align where possible with obligations overseas. We think this reduces the potential regulatory burden on digital platforms, and it means that ongoing international cooperation with relevant regulators is especially important given the global nature of these platforms. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Kate. You can see from Kate's comments, and we're very grateful that she made time to come because obviously she's busy. You can see from her comments how active the ACCC has been and how seriously the government has taken its role in dealing with digital platforms and the benefits, opportunities, but downsides of all of that. I can only say, speaking to academics and regulators overseas, I have experience of how influential the ACCC has been in the important global discussions around this. And one of the things I think is important from an Australian perspective is that we haven't merely mimicked what's been done overseas. We're quite a different sized jurisdiction. And while we try to align with others to the extent that we can, we've done some flexible, the codes that they're proposing. There's not at this stage a Digital Markets Act catching the whole conduct of a particular platform or operator, but the proposal is to designate each one, if necessary, in respect of a particular type of conduct, and the designation can be withdrawn and I think that that's a really very, very flexible way for a small jurisdiction to cope with all of this. So thank you very much. So our last speaker is Yan Yu from RBB Economics, who's speaking to us from Washington. She says it's not such an unsightly hour there, so I will hand over to her. Thank you very much, Yan, for making the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Healey, and thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, it's my honor to be on this panel. Sorry that I can't be there in person. So following other speakers, let me just provide a little bit more background on what's happening in China in the digital sector, and then perhaps we can have a bit more discussion on the so-called ecosystem concerns, which has been a very hot topic in recent years in the rest of the world. So as mentioned by Professor Hou, the development of China's digital economy has been ahead of the rest of the world for quite some time. Perhaps this is benefiting from early adoption of so-called QR codes and the nature of Chinese consumers being more willing to interact and consume content online. So nowadays, the so-called O2O business model has become a quite common phenomenon in the Chinese society. So for a very short, I would say relatively short period of time, and you see the Chinese society has moved on to become perhaps the first cashless society and leapfrogged from a cash-based system to the more advanced mobile payments. So skipped credit cards and debit cards, for example. So in China, you have Alipay and WeChat Pay, which are pretty much dominating the online payment system, even up to now. And it's perhaps one of the few, or if not the only country, I would say nowadays, where more consumption purchases actually happen online rather than offline. And the live streaming e-commerce, which is becoming uprising in the rest of the world, is actually a reality. It's pretty common in China. So unlike the rest of the world, the digital sector in China comprises domestic firms. Well, large conglomerates such as Alibaba mentioned earlier, Tencent, Baidu, and the rising star ByteDance, which is the holding company of Douyin, the equivalent of Chinese TikTok. Each one of them has built rather significant, complicated ecosystem over the years. And it's somehow even more, in the sense, at the grand level, concentrated compared to what we see in the rest of the world. The differences in China in terms of landscape obviously is driven by culture, language differences, and also the fact that many of the global platforms are simply not accessible in mainland China. This definitely creates opportunities for domestic firms to grow at very fast speed. However, the general dynamics underpinning those digital competition and the sector, the growth of the sector and digital competition, typical issues that agencies or the courts in China have been grappling with are quite similar. So as mentioned by Professor Hou, Chinese agencies has been slightly slow in the sense of relative to the growth of the sector when it comes to enforcement. That being said, there has been many litigation cases against large digital platforms, even going back to 2011. So the first abuse of dominance case in that sector was between Tencent and Qihoo 360. That happened in late 2010. So a lot of those issues that we are looking at today in Australia, for example, self-preferencing, exclusive dealing, traffic discrimination, discriminative conduct involving data and traffic allocation, etc. Those were raised many, many years ago, I would say, in China on those litigation matters. Unfortunately, as Kate mentioned, those cases take forever. So it wasn't, we didn't even wait to the moment where some of the litigations come out with the decisions. Some already stepped in and decided to enforce some more harsh or quick enforcement actions, and which led to the penalty on Alibaba back in 2020. So one common aspect of concern is this so-called digital ecosystem. So as I mentioned, this issue was raised in a number of litigation cases in the past 10 years. And in terms of merger, back in 2020, SAMR looked at a retrospective review, merger review between Meituan and Dazhong Dianping. So in that transaction, ecosystem concern was almost the center of the attention. So it's not a new issue in China. And the debate that we have at the moment in terms of whether the framework is still applicable, do we need new tools? Many of those were discussed and analyzed at the time. Fortunately, we had this opportunity to be involved in some of those cases. Ultimately, SAMR was taking a rather sensible approach to look at the fundamental concerns, factoring the competitive dynamics of the sector involved in the transaction and understanding where the source of competition concerns actually come from, the value of the data, the possibility of integration, data capability, etc., and then managed to come to the conclusion by using the current analytical framework. And so I would say, based on China's experience, it's not impossible to resolve some of those tricky questions, but the features, the unique features of digital sector and complexity of ecosystem does require a bit more study in that space, and case-specific approach is necessary. So I just want to perhaps bring us back a little bit to what is ecosystem, because it is a concept widely researched in the business, in the study of the business management. But when that translates into competition issues, the understanding of the competitive dynamics, implication of competition concern, it's, in my view, is yet to be improved. So the development of the digital ecosystem essentially reflect the trend of the increasing digital transformation in a modern society, and it provides a way for business to achieve economies of scale and or economy of scope, which is pretty common and known to us in the traditional conglomerate business models. But different from the traditional conglomerates, once a digital transformation is in place, and you can imagine the marginal cost of serving additional customers is often low, so that allow the ecosystem to expand rather rapidly without significant increase in cost in some instances. So the key differences you could see in the traditional sector, conglomerates would expand the business to adjacent markets or industries in order to achieve operational efficiencies, effective capital allocation, risk diversifications, etc. And those economy scopes are often driven by sharing infrastructure, supply chain, corporate services, etc. However, in the digital sector, ecosystems are established around one or more core services and leveraged into other adjacent segments using technology, sharing data, utilizing algorithm capabilities. So the data and algorithm capability are really in the center of the attention, and those can be shared and optimized to achieve efficiencies, and they can also improve user experience, quality services, and more importantly, innovative mechanisms for business to generate revenue. So antitrust concerns in this regards are often, in the digital sense, arising from the fact that the relationship between different products and services are interlinked, and that they're influencing each other. And you know, from economists' perspective, often we refer to the network effect, multi-sided markets, etc. So they're quite unique features compared to the traditional sectors when we talk about conglomerate effects. So those special features means that the mechanism of foreclosure might be different from the conventional portfolio effects concern that has been widely studied, adopted, and applied in the past. For instance, in the digital sense, that we can see their functionality overlaps across different digital apps. However, competition often takes in the form of differentiated services. Obviously, users are not going to switch to a completely or similar, exactly the same alternative app. They're looking for something better or more innovative. So this basically means that we cannot expect a replicate of existing digital platform or ecosystem, which often are the question we raise when we look at portfolio effects. So the conventional wisdom relying on rivals' ability to offer a competing portfolio product services to mitigate portfolio effects concern sometimes need to be amended, or in most cases, say probably need to be amended in order to evaluate differentiated offers that ultimately compete for the same user's attention in a digital world. So that's just one very prominent example showing how similar concerns can play out completely differently when we compare traditional market versus a digital market. So, but that being said, the one key issue when it comes to merger review of ecosystem theories of harm is the fundamental change in the mentality of non-horizontal mergers. Are those transactions likely lead to SLC? In the traditional mergers acquisitions where firms offering complementary or independent goods and services, those transactions are often considered less likely to lead to substantial lessening competition. Moreover, there was a presumption that efficiencies are usually good for competition and benefit consumers. Nowadays, competition authorities are challenging this presumption, and they are increasingly concerned of non-horizontal digital transactions, particularly when acquisition of the firm offering interdependent products and services and a leading platforms is involved, or purchase of a startup. And more importantly, if the transaction may lead to the entrenchment of any existing market dominance or market power, or create a barrier to entry or expansion in one or more of the markets comprising in the ecosystem. So those transactions are getting more attention in the rest of the world. So ecosystem theories of harm at the high level are not new. We have seen those in a number of transactions, including Google Fitbit that ACCC looked at. I believe similar concerns were raised, and in other transactions in the past, for example, Microsoft Activision, Meta Within, and those concerns were raised and looked at. But the tipping point perhaps is, or change, the shift change is perhaps the booking and e-traveler case, where the European Commission, the first time raising ecosystem concern as the main issue, and essentially challenging this non-horizontal foreclosure framework that we have been adopting or applying for up to now. So there's a heated debate about whether we see perceived gaps in that space. What was the cause of the gap? Are there any needs to change the framework? So this is a lively discussion, and I'm just throwing all the questions here because there are different views on many of those questions. But one thing I just want to highlight is that in terms of the entrenchment of market power, it is a very tentative issue because the efficiencies driving the growth of the digital platforms are actually potentially the ones contributing to the entrenchment of market power. So there is a very sensitive line there, that we need to draw. So I'll stop here, Deborah, then we can maybe discuss based on what other speakers have in mind.
For an interesting exposition in relation to the rising importance of ecosystems, as well as a whole range of other issues which you managed to throw in. I guess I'm particularly, just in one aside, China as a cashless society. I've been going to China for nearly 20 years, and the last time I went there last year, I couldn't do anything. I had Sophia Bai, one of our centre associates, was with me. I could not even buy, and having gone there many, many, many times, couldn't even buy a bottle of water on the roadside because I didn't have an app. Normally I would have paid cash or used my credit card. Couldn't use my credit card in any of the hotels. And that was only the change that had occurred since 2019. 2019, I saw it starting to happen. 2023, I can never go back to China again unless I take someone who is more au fait with Chinese apps or learn how to use them before I get there. So it's really become a cashless society. And I mean, that's happening in Australia too. You see, most recently, there's been a threat of collapse of cash delivery and collection services in Australia, which is currently being negotiated with government in a very noisy way after they were allowed to merge last year by the ACCC. So it's happening. We just need to get used to it. Those of you who deal with China probably are well aware of all of that, but I was a little shocked at the really complete inability to use cash or my credit card when I was there last time. Okay, so I think I'll start by asking each of the speakers to elaborate on one of their points, and then we might throw it open for discussion to the floor and online. So, Liyang, Professor Hou, I suppose you focused on e-commerce platforms and the differences between e-commerce platforms and traditional retailers. But can you pull out the major distinction between the two and the way that they're regulated in short form for participants?
Yeah, okay. So actually, our digital regulation started from regulating the e-commerce platform operators, because we did realize there's some major difference between e-commerce platform and the traditional, like the shopping malls, for example, because nowadays the e-commerce platform has done a lot of things which was done traditionally by the government. So, for example, in the offline world, when a seller would like to operate, it must firstly get a license from the government, and also it must comply with a lot of standards also adopted by the government. But for example, if you would like to sell something on eBay, on Alibaba, on Amazon, the first thing is for you to do is to sign a user agreement with those e-platform operators. And you have to comply with a lot of intra-platform rules published or adopted by those e-platform operators. So as we can see from here, those e-commerce platform has been function as a government in their own ways in the online environment. So that is a reason that we cannot solely rely on the self-regulation adopted by platform operators. We have to do something to make those roles, those self-regulated roles, to be governed by, well, we have to include them include them into the modern democracy. Let me put it that way. That is why China adopted the e-commerce regulation to regulate the behavior of e-commerce platform operators.
Okay, thank you very much. That's expanded on some of the things that you said in your presentation. I guess, Kate, one of the really interesting issues, I think, is how a country like Australia takes effective regulatory action against powerful global digital platforms, because we're such a relatively small jurisdiction. And we saw that when the media bargaining codes were imposed, and I think it was Facebook threatened to pull out of the jurisdiction and actually shut it down for a couple of days. And there now also comments that they won't pay for news under those codes. They won't renegotiate the agreements that they negotiated. So how can we deal with that in a way that's best for Australia? Because in relation to those codes, we have a very different media scenario to many other countries because of the size and of our economy and the distance between people, etc. So I'm hoping you can enlighten us on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Well, I think as I alluded to in my speaking points before, we're very well aware that Australia is a smaller jurisdiction, and it's part of the reason why we are looking to be internationally aligned with the obligations that have been adopted in larger jurisdictions, particularly Europe and the UK, Germany, Japan, and places like Korea. There's a great deal of value particularly in dealing with very large global businesses in having similar types of obligations that extend not only on the platforms themselves, because it reduces regulatory burden on them having to comply with similar obligations across different jurisdictions, but also makes life a little bit easier for us as a regulator in that we're adopting something that's already been rolled out in another jurisdiction. Having said that, I think it's not impossible. Every jurisdiction has its own particular laws and ways of doing things, and so there is likely to be change between various jurisdictions, and we don't think that's a terrible thing. The News Media Bargaining Code legislation is an example of Australia doing something a little bit different than what was adopted in other jurisdictions. In Europe, they went down more of a copyright route in order to deal with some of those issues that arose there, but we chose a different pathway. So I don't think that it's a bar necessarily to doing things slightly differently, but I think that having said that, the practical realities of dealing with global digital platforms, which I do on a daily basis, means you have to be prepared for the consequences. So, and Facebook withdrawing its services is an example of the type of consequences that these global platforms are not afraid to take these steps in their own interest if they think that that's necessary. So for their long-term economic well-being. So.
And I can add that even when I was a practitioner, competition law practitioner, large international firms want to do things that make their lives easier, but there are really significant differences in the impact of their conduct on different jurisdictions that really need to be factored in. So it seems to me that the ACCC gives when it can and digs in when it can't.
Well, another area in which we're quite well leading is our safety laws. So e-safety, the cybersecurity, we're quite out in front in terms of a lot of other jurisdictions overseas in having obligations in that space. So the e-safety commission has been putting out papers on things like deep fakes with AI coming out. There's quite a lot of research going on and quite a lot of thinking. They have the BOS, what they call them, the basic online safety expectations, which set out what platforms should do online and how they should deal with, have a dispute resolution process in relation to content online that's not safe, particularly for children and adults. So there is quite a bit of movement there, and then things being done in different sort of areas of digital related work. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that individual jurisdictions can't do things, but I do think there's value in international alignment.
Thank you very much. And look, finally for Yan, I guess it would be interesting to look at the issue of anti-competitive detriment, entrenchment of market power by the conduct of digital platforms and other digital companies, and how it aligns with the sorts of efficiencies that large corporations can bring to a transaction or to an area. Could you please give us your views on how those two marry up in a digital environment?
Sure. Yeah, well, before we talk about this entrenchment market power, I suppose it's probably worth flagging out that for many years when the rest of the world looking at SAMR's approach on mergers and acquisitions, one of the key criticisms on China's approach is about this efficiency offense. So when global transactions are taking place and filing in China, often they run into new issues where SAMR were concerned that the increased efficiency as a result of the transaction is going to make it even harder for some of the domestic players to compete effectively. So they often come out with different market definition, slightly different behavior remedies in order to get the deal through. So that for a long time was a criticism by the rest of the world. But now in the digital sense, the entrench of market power does remind me a bit about this old days when efficient offense was in the center of the tension in China. The reason I'm concerned about that is because the irony is the value creation of a digital ecosystem often hinge on the interaction between different types of economic agents connected by the system, whether they are users, advertisers, content creators, app developers, or users functioning as different roles. So the relevant importance of data, the ability of data integration, algorithm application, those are contributing to the efficiencies of the whole system and actually attribute to the user experience improvement. So the so-called network effects are actually positive in many ways. But that said, it doesn't mean that those network effects are not going to lead to any problem in specific cases. So the entrenchment of market power without the condition of a substantial lessening of competition in the short run, in my view, getting very close to this so-called efficiency offense. But it is totally understandable that in the digital sense, there might be a concern in the long run whether innovation would be more lively, consumers will be better off if there are more competing platforms or ecosystems emerging in the market instead of having one large ecosystem in operation. So the key question, I suppose, is whether we can articulate, or from regulators' perspective, whether it is possible to articulate the concerns in terms of exactly worries that so we have in mind. In specific cases, are we talking about innovative theory of harm, or we're talking about long-term consumer harm? Otherwise, it gets a bit messy. Some of the transactions could be pro-competition in the short run, but the concerns ACCC or other agencies had in mind might be much longer time horizon. So it's no good or bad, but I suppose the term itself can be a bit daunting, having had this experience, working on transactions in China where efficient offense often create a lot of uncertainty to the business.
Thank you very much. Look, I would like to actually throw open to questions from the floor at this point, and we'll have a few from the floor, and then we'll go to some online questions. Does anyone have a question for any of our panelists? You can see there are 2 questions over here. First, to Andrew Robb at the front, and then to my friend at the back.
Thanks very much, and thank you to all of those that have contributed so far. It's been excellent. Look, I just wanted to raise the issue of personal data protection. Notwithstanding the regulations, and they're significant here, and apparently now in China, the whole emergence of cyber has, I think, jumped over a lot of the data protection issues. And let me just give you one example, and I've got a suggestion to see how it plays out. Since Medicare was attacked, I have found personally endless new emails. I never got that many targeted. Not only am I getting so many new unwanted emails, they're very well targeted that for my age and circumstance. And what it tells me, before I went into the federal parliament at the turn of the century, I ran and set up the Australian arm of the biggest data marketing company in the US. And even back then, it's a quarter of a century, we were doing big data and taking data from Roger David and the banks, combining it, doing analytics, separating it, giving it back and showing the relationships. My point is that I think a lot of this data is being sold via the black market to legitimate data marketing companies. And data marketing companies are then taking this stolen data and combining it with their analytics and selling it now to endless companies, and it all looks so legitimate. Now, I think there should be, from a data protection and ACCC, there is a capacity to really examine and penalise any of the data marketing companies that can't demonstrate how they were able to gain some highly sophisticated and comprehensive personal data that is not permission based. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. For any of you who don't know Andrew was formerly a minister of the Australian government and was minister when the free trade agreement with Australia and China was negotiated. So we're extremely grateful that he's here and grateful for his insight. I guess I should direct that question to Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Rob. I'm going to do my best since I'm not from the Office of Information Commissioner. Look, our 8th report, which has not yet been published but is with the Assistant Treasurer, it covers some of these issues, and it's an attempt to explain to the Australian public and to the government what is actually happening to data markets now. The reason why we wanted to look at that in one of our reports was we think that the average person's understanding of what happens to their data is not really reflective of what's actually happening to their data these days, and that the digitisation, if you like, of the whole process has meant that the days of kind of turning up to your car yard and buying a car and filling out a form and that data being shared with an insurance person potentially or someone else, and even marketing lists, they're long gone. Most of the data firms that we spoke to as part of the inquiry strongly objected to being called data brokers. So they refer to themselves as data analytics companies, data enrichment companies, data service firms. But all of that is just to say that they provide data products and services, and then they increasingly buy that data from a large range of places, and much larger than we ever anticipated before. If you go to a pub these days and you buy a pizza and you use an app, you usually have to tick the box that says I consent, and you provide all that information when you're ordering. Almost every interaction, and as you would know if you went to China and you can only use an app these days, everything that we do is recorded. Everything is a data collection exercise. So increasingly, I think consumers are not as aware as possibly they should be that everything they do is being collected and fed into this process. So we didn't make recommendations in our report. It was more of a attempting to shine a light on this particular industry and explain how it works for the benefit of Australians and also for the government. But I think possibly there's some of the issues you've raised might be being looked at as part of the review of the Privacy Act. I know that's been going on for quite a bit of time now, but I think the complexities there have meant that that's review's taken quite a bit longer than it might have in other circumstances. But I think some of the issues, particularly around targeted advertising, my understanding was those were going to be dealt with in a second tranche by the review from the Attorney General's Department. The first tranche was the more straightforward stuff about what isn't personal information, for example. But the targeted marketing material was going to be dealt with in a secondary tranche.
Thank you very much, Kate. Another question over here. Could you please give us your name and say where you're from? which would be, I think, be good.
Okay, thanks so much. My name is Hao Xue. So I have a question to Professor Hou. So thanks so much for your fantastic sharing. So I have just been aware that you have mentioned some antitrust decisions made by China's government since 2020, and you have also mentioned the Alibaba case. So we know that China's government has just imposed unprecedented antitrust duties to Alibaba company for its exclusive dealings you have mentioned. So I can just remember that at that time, such a great antitrust duties has just gave rise to incredible controversies in domestic Chinese public. So many people and experts claim that the antitrust decisions made by the Chinese government against Alibaba was not wholly determined by the fundamental facts and laws, but they have just taken a lot of irrelevant political considerations into account. So there is a very prevalent argument in academia that the China's competition regulations are always used to deter or restrict the development of private companies in China. So in this sense, my question is, Professor Hou, based on your observation or perspectives, do you have any comments on this debate? And based on your observation, is there any weakness of the current China's competition legal framework? And is there anything that will need to revised or amended in fostering a healthier digital economy in China? Thanks so much, Professor Hou.
Thank you. That's about 5 questions, but thank you. They're all good. Professor Hou.
Okay, so many thanks. This question, there are so many things I have not touched upon in my presentation, because I think it's better to give everybody an overview, then we can look at some more topic issues. So your question is also debated in China. So first, let's look back to the facts of the Alibaba case. As just explained, the case involves a strategy applied by Alibaba to require its business users to operate only on Alibaba, not on its competing platforms like Pinduoduo and JD.com. The case was such a conduct is called exclusive dealing in antitrust regime. Well, I should say that the analysis is not really solid. I just give you one example to say why I say this case the analysis is not solid. So the authority just analyzed some data about market shares of Alibaba in a period when it applied exclusive dealing. So such a strategy was maintained for 3 years. During such a 3-year period, Alibaba's market share was reduced from 70% to 55%. So it's very weird that after implementing such a strategy, its market share was not increased, but decreased. So in a sense, well, if you do not carry out sort of counterfactual analysis, it's very difficult to say that Alibaba's strategy produced an competitive effect, because its market shares decreased, not increased. So but the authority did not look at such a matter, directly jumped into its conclusion that Alibaba's conduct produced an competitive effect. So there are some gaps in its in the Chinese analysis, but well, I won't say that. Well, as you just said, the decision was political, not legal. it might not consistent with traditional antitrust approach, but that's kind of a normal in the antitrust decisions in the digital sector. If you look at the decision adopted by the European Union, you might observe a lot of similarities. So, for example, if you read the decision about Google self-preference made by European Commission, the decision is very long, like more than 200 pages. But when coming to the core of the justifications, I mean, you can also find that the European Commission did not explain the foundation for its decision very well. And if you can also read the judgment made by the German court on Facebook's exploitation of personal data, it's also a very strange decision because it used competition law to punish Facebook's collection of personal data. Well, so my conclusion here is that there indeed something strange in the digital sector which cannot be solved by traditional competition law. That is why those jurisdictions, EU, German, China, just as I just strengthened enforcement of competition law in this sector, and that comes to another issue, and we recently have observed in many countries like EU, like China, Japan, United States, and in Australia, I suppose also the same, that the government either has adopted like the Digital Markets Act in the EU or are proposing something similar in China, Australia, regulatory regulations to complement the enforcement of competition law. So what I want to say that the digital sector is really different from the traditional sectors. There are some things, I mean, forced the government to do something innovative. Okay, that's my answer.
Thank you very much. There's another question over here, and then one there, and then we'll throw it open to and one over here. So we have three at the moment.
All right. Perfect. Thank you very much to all the panelists. It was very interesting. My name is Marian Unterstell. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Luxembourg, here as a visiting researcher with the UNSW. And my question focuses basically on what will the future of regulation be? Because I see an issue, and maybe I would like to know if you see it too and how to resolve it. It basically comes from two different assumptions. First, we heard perfectly by Ms. Liyang Hou that there are many particularities to these digital platforms, many new risks posed by their scale, by their new mixed business model offering different kinds of services, financial services, as well as goods. And that we have these particularities and particular risks to that. So it leads me to the assumption that in jurisdictions we need laws regulating that are quite specific on their business model. So in a jurisdiction, you maybe have like 10 of these large platforms, maybe only 5. So it's quite particular and quite focused on that business model. But on the other hand, we have the issue that we learned that in maybe 2 or 3 years, the whole landscape can completely change from being able to use credit cards to only having digital payments, and also taking into account that these platforms have the economic power to just buy themselves into new business parts. So on the one hand, we need quite particular laws, but on the other hand, landscape is changing so fast, and the underlying technologies, that we also need law that is adaptive. And how can we achieve that? How can they? Because for me, it seems like a conflict to have that particular requirement, but also being able to adapt that fast and then have a more open law.
Thank you. Who would like to answer that? Kate? Or, I mean, I guess from an Australian perspective, we've done that by the suggestions that have been made for. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you like to? Yan, would you like to speak?
Sure, I can maybe perhaps provide my perspective, and Professor Hou can step in to add more your points. That's a very good question. So it is worth looking back to the Alibaba case. I know we talked about this, but it's a very good example to show how or rushed enforcement could potentially damage the synergies or natural organic growth of a market. So when the decision came out by SEMA, the e-commerce landscape in China was just in the transition of changing towards this so-called live streaming e-commerce business model. So there was a debate at the time whether those new innovative e-commerce platforms are in the relevant market. Are they able to constrain traditional marketplaces such as Alibaba, Jingdong.com, Pinduoduo, etc.? And the authority took the view that the relevant market does include those innovative platforms. However, they also take the view that those constraints were not sufficient to prevent Alibaba from exercising market power unilaterally to the extent of harming consumers or foreclosing competition. So shortly after the decision, if I recall correctly, within 6 months, if not longer, we see e-commerce changing dramatically in China. Many of those transactions start to appear in platforms like Douyin, which is TikTok, or social media platforms or content platforms promoted by influencers. So it was quite interesting to actually see, you know, the change happened anyway, with or without that decision. So I think the issue is, do we have to give up everything we have built up to now in antitrust law just because digital sector is so complicated? But I think we have learned a lot over the years, cases or regulatory study improvement. So I still believe it is possible to look at specific case, understand the industry, get to the bottom of the core concerns and identify issues that we want to fix, and then try to impose a form of enforcement that create the minimal damage to the efficiency of the sector. So it is a very tough exercise, but it could be even more dangerous if we completely move away from what we have learned up to now.
Thank you. Professor Hou, we're running out of time, but Professor Hou and then Kate. And I don't know if we have any questions online. Do we have questions online? No. Okay, good. Well, we can finish this one and maybe have one more before we finish.
I might actually go next, if that's all right,
Yes,
Deborah. Look, I think it's something that exercises my mind all the time, because in our direction, our 5-year direction, we had a list of digital platform services that we were reporting on and looking into. That list was written at the end of 2019 and is already out of date, frankly. So when we are talking to government about regulatory reform and how we want it to be introduced, obviously it's a matter for government, but I am very conscious that the framework that needs to be adopted needs to be sufficiently flexible for us to continue to move with the technology and continue to be able to address issues as they arise. It may not always be competition law that is the right answer in relation to digital wallets, and it may be the payments regulation is the right way in order to address those issues. But we have to be, as a government, sufficiently flexible in order to keep addressing those issues. The definition of what is a digital platform service keeps me up at night, so particularly in the context of AI. And so I think we just need to keep need to keep moving. Part of what we've suggested in our recommendations are targeted obligations on particular designated services. So I would hope that the government would adopt a sufficiently flexible definition of what could be a designated service to allow us to write codes in relation to those particular services. But that's something that will be the subject of ongoing discussions.
Yeah, well, I just also add a few words on that. Yes, you're pretty right. The digital sector is very dynamic. So my personal view on that is not for the government is not to regulate, but the idea might be co-regulation. I just add one example to the dynamics in the sector. So the difficulty in regulating the sector based on competition law is a boundary between different markets. I think the dynamics makes a boundary like very unclear. So for example, in China, the fierce competition in the digital sector now takes place between Tencent and TikTok. But it might be very difficult to understand why it takes place, because one is kind of instant messenger, another one short video sharing platform. Normally they should not compete. But if you look at the designation of gatekeepers, recently made by the European Commission, you can find that the two platforms are on the sort of same run market. Both are designated gatekeeper for social network. So they are sort of providing the same digital service. So we can see here that some digital services are kind of converging without but it's not based on our traditional knowledge. That's my comment.
Thank you. This gentleman here, and then over there. Please keep it to a question, and then we'll get a chance to. And if you have a specific, if you have a specific person you'd like to, that would be really good.
My question is how much she enjoyed the session. She had to go to a meeting as per usual. My question is basically, Kate, about some of it's just one specific thing, which is the ACCC aware of when the government will release its response to DPSI 5 on regulatory reform, and in particular that aspect that we've been talking about a couple of times now, being the new legislative framework potentially for service-specific codes?
So in December last year, the government supported in principle the recommendations in the fifth report. So we are working with Treasury, and we understand that the government may put out a further consultation document sort of mid to late this year. So, but beyond that, I don't have any specific timing. It's a matter for Treasury.
Thank you. And over here.
Hi, this is a question for Kate. My name's Steve Ellis. I'm with Blockchain APAC. A functional question, Kate. I have sympathy and empathy for the challenge you face. I was giving digital strategy advice a decade ago, and the problem with decision makers is they said social media is not media. And I found every door closed because everyone said this isn't a thing until they thought it was shaping the future of elections, and it had destroyed their business models. And I see exactly the same thing playing out in digital assets at the moment. How do you deal with the functional challenge that is those that you answer to, and sort of generally the decision makers, they're not on these platforms? Okay, when I'm in most rooms and I say to people, I'm on TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter all day, every day, and people don't think it's a thing, but they're tasking you with cleaning up ultimately what could have been in plain sight sort of challenges. So curious as to how you address that sort of that lagging indicator of what these platforms actually can and will do.
It's a really good question, and I think certainly I think there's been movement in the last couple of years quite dramatically. Certainly, I know there's still a number of politicians who'd prefer to read the AFR rather than see what people are saying on TikTok and social media about government policy. But part of the reason for our work and what strongly drives me in producing the 6 monthly reports is to try and educate the broader Australian community and also decision makers within government about what these services do, what they're capable of, how many people are using them. As I said earlier, $93 billion of value in Australian on app wallet transactions. So in 2023, so there's a lot of money being spent on these now digital platforms. We're spending almost 5 hours a day on our smartphones now. So I think the more that we can educate them through this work that we're doing as to how important these platforms now are to our daily lives, the ACCC's view is they are critical to the economy, and that talking of the digital economy and the real economy is a bit of a misnomer now. Like, the digital economy is the real economy. So, but I think that it's a continuing learning curve that we're on with policymakers and broader parts of government.
Thank you. Well, look, we're over time, and I think that we will need to wind up now. But I'd just like to get you to join me in thanking our speakers. I think they've provided some outstanding insights into what's going on now, how it will affect people operating in markets as buyers and sellers, both in Australia and China. And I'd like to ask you to show some applause for our speakers. Thank you.